quite timely. Restoring terrestrial ecosystems is included in the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and many global, regional, and local restoration efforts are underway, with quite, really large commitments to restore millions of hectares of land with public and private financing. For instance, to support the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, the World Bank aims to put $1 billion in institutional investments in African countries by 2030, and impact investors have also pledged about half of that value for restoration under the initiative. But how will these efforts be successful in the current land tenure context, where 70% of land in developing countries is unregistered? How can those who restore degraded lands and forests, such as women who may currently have rights to such marginal land, maintain their rights once the land becomes more valuable upon restoration? And how can investors manage their operational, financial, and reputational risks of insecure tenure when undertaking restoration projects? Finally, how can restoration efforts truly be sustainable if land governance is weak, or when statutory and customary land tenure systems exist in so many countries? So I think the answer to these questions really lies in strengthening land and resource tenure for all, especially vulnerable populations like women, through more inclusive laws and policies that codify customary tenure rights, enforcement of these laws and policies, and strong land administration systems and institutions. These activities to strengthen tenure are a really important priority for USAID as we assist our host country governance in creating strong land governance systems in their path towards self-reliance. But even in countries that currently have weak land governance or uncertain land rights, there are also opportunities for land-based investments to not only respect, but also to strengthen local people's land rights in or near their investments as a way to both mitigate projects' land risks and also to respect human rights. And USAID is working at this nexus. We have partnered with several companies, including Hershey's, the Moringa Partnership, Ecom Agro-Industrial, and Alovo Sugar Africa, to demonstrate that responsible investment can be good for both business and society. And we'll be publishing case studies around these specific investment projects in the next couple of weeks. You can find that on LandLinks, which is USAID's land tenure portal. We also initiated a first-of-its-kind investor survey of land rights, along with partners Indufor North America and the European Investment Bank. And the results of the survey will be presented to you in just a minute. To date, there had been no systematic study of how investors and business operators actually assess and seek to mitigate land tenure risks. Without a clear understanding of these issues, USAID and other development agencies are limited in our efforts to develop policies, programs, and partnerships that create win-win scenarios for both businesses and local communities. So the purpose of the survey was to gather information directly from investors regarding how they deal with risks to their investments stemming from unclear or weak land tenure and property rights, to first better inform our own efforts to support responsible investment, and also to provide the investor community with ideas and possible strategies for creating such responsible investments. So through the survey, we gathered information from dozens of companies, and the results really provide useful insights into their perceptions and also practices around mitigating land tenure risks. Some companies were even kind enough to allow us to write case studies about their experiences, which provide a more detailed picture of how investors and operators confront land tenure challenges in specific investments, and also seek to provide benefits to local land rights holders. USAID does not endorse the companies or projects featured in the case studies. Rather, they represent an effort to share lessons on how real companies have dealt with or continue to deal with land tenure risks by engaging with communities, sharing benefits, and budgeting for continuous activities related to managing land tenure challenges. So now I'd like to invite Jeff Hatcher, who is the Managing Director of Indufor North America, to present the results of the survey. And then after the presentation, we will invite our other panelists to share their experiences with land tenure risk mitigation.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon to everyone. I've heard several references already today to land tenure as a constraint or as an obstacle to sustainable investments in landscape solutions. Like Sarah mentioned, we're going to present the key findings from the first ever private sector investor survey on land rights. I think you'll find it interesting to compare what you do with what we've seen around the world. And the idea of the survey really is to put a mark in the sand and say, here's where we are today in 2018 in terms of risk perception and strategies to overcome problems related to land tenure, and also looking forward towards the future of new production models that might be more aware of land tenure constraints at the local level and more proactive, engaging communities. So a quick overview of the survey. The survey was targeted at investors and operators in agriculture, forestry, and renewable energy. We took a very broad approach, but we wanted meaningful answers, so we had two criteria. The first criteria to be participant in the survey is that you are actively working, or your company actively works in land-based investments. So that's a lot of people, a lot of companies. But it meant that the responses come from companies that are actually engaged on the ground or investing in projects on the ground. The second criteria is that the respondent has to at least, or the company that they work for has to at least own 10% stake in a land-based investment. We were looking for people that not only had up-to-date information, but also some skin in the game and had been part of finding solutions to land tenure challenges. The survey was implemented in November, December last year, with analysis early this year. And we included 6 case studies, which we think provide a lot more context and richness to the narrative around land and how companies in the geographies that we've identified have responded to challenges. In total, this was the first time the survey had been implemented, and in total we had 75 companies qualified to respond to the survey. These companies primarily come from North America, Europe, and Africa, but they also operate globally. So you'll see in the graphic there that the headquarter country is the circle, and then the flow into the region where they operate or invest. There's limited response rates from Asia, which could be improved in the future, but there was still some responses in South America, Central America, Australia as well. The respondents provided details, very detailed information on 102 projects that they either invested in or reviewed for investment but rejected. 63 projects were submitted that had been undertaken by the respondent, and 39 cases where the respondent had evaluated an investment opportunity but ultimately rejected it due to a reason that we wanted to understand a little bit better. In terms of stats, the projects that were provided to us in the survey, they valued $5.2 billion, kind of estimated by the respondent. We weren't able to corroborate that, but it does give you a sense of the scale of the information that was collected. By far, the highest number of projects were in Africa, where we had more than 40 projects submitted with a value of around $1 billion. And the most frequent sector there was the agricultural sector. The second highest response rate came from projects in South America, where we had between 20 and 40 projects with a value of about $1.3 billion. And that was primarily in the forestry sector, followed by North America, which had between 10 and 20 projects for at a value of about $1.4 billion, where the sector that led the way really was renewable energy. So you see, as you see the results of our survey, bear in mind that there is limited response rates from the other regions, though there is some response. And in the other regions, the value of the projects amounts to about $400 million in Asia, Oceania, and Europe. So the findings. The full report is available upstairs. You can find it at the USAID booth, but I'll present kind of the top 6 findings that we thought were interesting, would hopefully spark a debate here today. So the first, and it's corroborated by the survey that was on Slido, we found that 60% of the respondents report that land tenure risks are increasing significantly or very significantly in the past 5 years. Okay, that's great. That's a pretty blanket statement, but what risks really were increasing? And here's where we start to see some of the nuance and some of the interesting findings. A lot of thought going into property rights security for investment focuses on the risk of expropriation or the risk of having invalid land titles, but what we found was the respondents that responded to our survey really focused on was community rights to access resources and local community land disputes as being the key risks that had increased in the past 5 years. The second finding is that for operators that responded to the survey, land tenure risk was the second most important risk that they faced amongst a set of typical business risks. So it really only followed market risks. Whereas the investors that responded to the survey placed land tenure risk as the seventh most important risk, following other more potentially germane topics to them like liquidity risk or regulatory risk. The third finding is that land tenure risks had led to a significant number of rejected projects. So you recall we had 39 cases in our sample where the project was rejected by the investor. So they had done due diligence, they understood the dynamics of the project, but ultimately rejected it. In 66% of those projects, land tenure risk was one of the major reasons that they rejected the project. So given that it's an increasing risk and that it is leading to foregone opportunities, what standards or what guidance do companies look for when making their investment decisions or improving their operations on the ground? It's not on the slide here, but we found quite interesting to note that in the past several years, there have been a lot of guidance documents written to help companies incorporate higher standards on land tenure, specifically spurred on by the voluntary guidelines on land tenure. But there's very little awareness amongst the survey respondents. Less than a quarter of respondents had any awareness of the voluntary guidelines or associated guidance documents. But there was an overwhelming awareness of the IFC performance standards, which of course do talk about land. The 2 points that we put here on the slide have to do with the commitments that the company itself had made. And what we saw was within our respondent base, about 70% of the companies have made a commitment to or adhere to some voluntary certification standard. For example, the FSC certification, which also includes criteria related to land tenure rights or indigenous people. But at the corporate level, there's a bit less strong corporate commitment to general ESG standards, and only a quarter of the respondents had made a public commitment to ESG standards in the survey at least. So that has some implications for public accountability or improving things over time. Okay. Of the 75 respondents, of the respondents, all of the case studies that were presented, that the companies that presented those case studies do evaluate land tenure risks. The majority, or 100% of them, use some qualitative method to analyze land tenure risk and assess how the risk related to land tenure might affect their project. The most common being community consultations or doing some mapping of land rights holdings. The least common qualitative method really was relying on government information. And so if you think about geographies where the respondents are coming from, that might give you an indication of where there might be some room to improve. But we found it particularly interesting that given the fact that these are investors, they're companies, they deal with numbers, they deal with dollars, there's very little quantitative assessment of the risks of land tenure to their projects. And so the scenario analyses or shadow pricing methods that we asked about had a very low uptake in the survey respondent base. The last key finding has to do with, well, once you've invested in a project and you do see a land tenure issue, what do you do about it? We asked, of the projects that had gone forward, so those 63 cases where the company had made the investment, what were the strategies that the company used to deal with land tenure risks, and were they effective? By far, the most common strategies really were stakeholder engagement and community development programs, but they had a mixed result in terms of success. What we found interesting, and it relates to one of the comments made earlier this morning about supporting land titling in Burundi from Laura Tuck, was that though used less in the respondent projects, doing support to community land titling had a very high degree of success, though used less frequently, and also engaging community members in outgrower production models had a high degree of success. The more exclusionary tactics, like hiring guards, putting up fences, and working with the government, generally had lower success rates. The last component of the project really is the case studies. We'll highlight a few of the key findings that come from the case studies. I think you'll find the cases to be quite interesting. 3 of the companies asked to remain confidential or anonymous. So we think that there's quite a lot of frank information in the cases about what challenges they faced and how they dealt with them. And 3 agreed to be public. Those are African Plantations for Sustainable Development in Ghana, Energia Veleta in Mexico, which is a wind power company, and the Moringa Partnership, which operates in Africa and Latin America. So a couple highlights from the case studies. The first was the importance of conducting initial land tenure and livelihood assessments to really understand where you're operating, to ascertain whether or not you have a social license to operate, and to identify ways that the project can benefit communities. The second point was that several of the cases talked about providing pro bono or free legal services to communities for the negotiation of land leases or to work with them to get their land rights legally registered. The third point is the simple fact that the companies many of the companies in our cases, they plan for and budget for working with communities on an ongoing basis. And that includes establishing a grievance mechanism which requires administrative support, systems, and outreach. The fourth point has to do with the outgrower model, and not only allowing for contracting of farmers, but providing them with incentives to participate, training to increase their yields, and participating very effectively in having an open dialogue with the company. The last point that seemed to emerge, and the panel has 2 investors on it, or maybe 3 if we count the IFC here. I think they're definitely an investor. But that the investors can work with their investees to reach standards. So many of the opportunities on the ground might not be at the highest level of international standards regarding land tenure, but that proactive engagement with the investees, setting up environmental, social, and governance management systems, and action plans at the local level can be a key support provided by the investor to the investee to reach standard. So to conclude, a few of the implications that we've identified and which might spark conversation. The first is to assess land tenure risks early and often. Land tenure dynamics change in an area where new investment is coming in, making sure that the company is aware of what its effect has been on land rights over the course of the project would be important. Engage rather than exclude. Clearly, from the projects that were sampled, the actions taken to integrate the community member and provide support to them work better than exclusionary tactics. But there's also now a growing body of evidence on what works and what doesn't, what it costs, who you need to hire, how do you budget for it, how do you improve over time to ensure that your company is operating at the highest level in terms of respecting land rights. And the final point is just making a general commitment to respecting legitimate land rights. In geographies where we work, legitimate land rights is open to interpretation. It's a difficult concept, but it does require thought, and it does require an openness, understanding the history of an area, the dynamics at play, and who really holds legitimate rights to land, and making that commitment at the corporate level and engendering that thought process throughout the entire company seems to be a key to success for the cases that we've profiled. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeff. So now I'd like to invite our other 3 panelists to please come join us on stage, and we'll hopefully have a robust discussion around this topic. So we have here with us today Mary Kate Bullen, Mark Constantine, and Sylvia Wisniewski. Mary Kate is the Associate Director of Sustainability and Communications at New Forests. She's part of New Forests' Investor Services team and leads the company's Sustainability and Corporate Communications program. Mark Constantine works at the International Finance Corporation, EIFC. He provides environmental and social risk management support on forestry and agribusiness investments for the IFC's Manufacturing, Agribusiness, and Services Department. And Sylvia Wisniewski is Managing Director of Finance in Motion, where she oversees risk management and investor relations. She has more than 25 years of experience in development finance in over 30 countries and started her career at GIZ, the German International Cooperation. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us to discuss the results of the survey and really more broadly private sector approaches and strategies around land-based risk management. So I'm going to ask the first question to you, Mary Kate, while I transition over here to the mic. I'm curious whether the results of the survey resonate with you in your work in making investments into land.
Thanks very much. Absolutely, they resonate. Coming from the perspective of a fund manager, I think there's things in every slide that Jeff presented that we're dealing with, or techniques and strategies we're using to manage. I thought I would just try and highlight where we sit and how maybe the risk perceptions differ from different types and levels of investors. And particularly, it was raised earlier today, and I think the IUCN session, that the first question an investor is going to ask is, what's my land tenure risk? How do I know I still have this asset? Is it really mine? That's absolutely a question we have when we deal with our prospective investors or current clients. They want to know, particularly for the emerging markets funds, is this asset something that's going to be mine forever? From a fund management perspective, that's actually not as big an issue for us because the geographies we're working in, we understand the legal tenure, we understand the forestry licenses and permits, and we actually don't see a high risk of privatization or loss of those resources in a formal way. What we're looking at is much more on the level of, I think it was number 2, encroachment, and sort of the lack of customary land recognition that we have to deal with. So it's about how we can assess early on what is the actual land use situation on the ground and how does that differ from formal land tenure. For a bit of quick perspective, New Forest, we're a fund manager operating in 3 very different geographies: Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and the US. If we want to diligence an asset when we're going through DD in Australia, New Zealand, land tenure doesn't come up anywhere in investment committee paper, but what you will see is somebody does a check and makes sure that all your land titles registered in the office correctly, and it's something a lawyer gets paid to do, and you just see the tick box that that's done and that's correct. Very different when it comes to us investing in Asia, where we're trying to say, how are people using land, what's going on, how will it affect my operations, and how might it affect our reputation risk. Give you an example of what land tenure DD can look like in the field. It's actually riding around in a truck with the GPS in your hand and marking every time you see an instance of possible encroachment, and then saying, does this match up with what the company is telling me or what they've said is going on? It's about sort of digging under the hood a little bit to see where these things are. And while we see that as a risk, what I want to highlight is that it's actually also an opportunity, because while we're trying to understand the situation prior to making an investment, it's about making sure that we can manage the situation after we invest and trying to create better value for the company and for the communities. So one of the major strategies that we use, and it takes the sort of qualitative techniques that were listed in the slide, the sort of half dozen of those, is looking to identify opportunities for what we call shared value, which is where you're using a business solution to address a social problem. So if that problem is lack of formal recognition of land rights, unclear boundaries, lack of economic opportunities in a region, it's saying, how can this business, this plantation company operating here, actually find a way to improve the community's situation, their land tenure issue, their economic opportunities by working together. And it comes back to another finding of the study that outgrower models and smallholders are particularly promising because that's a direct alignment. You're able to provide economic development, you're giving a job, you're making sort of shared use of land allocations. And from a company perspective, you're just getting improving scale. So you're improving the situation for you as a company, for the communities, and also improving returns back to your investors. So definitely different elements there of that survey that resonate very high level.
Thanks, Mary Kate. I think you made some really good points there, especially I want to sort of reiterate that last point that you see this as an opportunity and that it is really important to respect land and resource rights of communities, but there's also the opportunity to create benefits for them so that they actually support different types of investment, right? And that's a really important point. Thank you. So Mark, on to a question for you. So the survey results show that there's a pretty high awareness of IFC performance standards, especially among investors. What do you think is key to incentivizing companies to not only adhere, of course, to these and other best practices on land tenure, but to really make them a part of their company fabric?
Okay, thanks. First of all, I think most of you know, but just for the record, IFC is the private sector investment arm of the World Bank Group, so our business, our job is to promote private sector development that will grow employment, reduce poverty, and so on. We believe in inclusive development models, and so that takes you directly to tenure as a cornerstone of tenure security, as a cornerstone of being able to promote long-term, particularly in the agricultural, other large land footprint-based industries. I want to clarify that I don't see quite the distinction maybe between investors and operators in terms of awareness of the performance standards, simply coming from a somewhat IFC-centric standpoint, but you could also extend that to the equator banks who also adhere to the IFC performance standards. Basically, anybody connected to financial sources that adheres to the performance standards is essentially imposing or passing on or requiring that the operator abide by those performance standards. So one of the challenges we face is that we're now moving what I would say is called down market. So traditionally, IFC's client base was, in the earlier days, multinational companies that wanted to set up shop, a production capacity in a developing country. Today, it's much more we're working with companies already domiciled in developing countries. And the challenge there is that those companies, which tend to be smaller, they may be part of a supply chain, but they themselves have comparatively low capacity. And in many cases, for example, they may have taken over the private management or ownership or operation of what was formerly a government concession. Why does that matter? Because you then tend to encounter legacy issues. So one of the points, just to follow on what Kate said, is that you have to understand, and Jeff made the point in the survey results, you have to understand the context in which you're operating. In my experience, where we have gotten into trouble with our investments is when we haven't understood that local operating context. And there again, tenure, and this, I must say I was pleased to hear, given the theme of this panel, how often tenure was referenced this morning in different statements. So it makes clear in a good way that there is a growing awareness of it as a foundational dimension of how companies have to operate and generate this local license to operate. So.
Thanks, Mark. And that's true. Legacy land issues are there basically everywhere. They're very complex, and it's important to acknowledge that they exist, but then also that there are opportunities to deal with them and recognize them. I think I really encourage folks to read the case studies. They're really detailed and provide lots of strategies that companies use to understand what the tenure rights are existing in and around their investments. And I think some of them point to instances where the company did some due diligence, thought it had a good understanding, and then started operating and realized, oh, we didn't realize this aspect of those legacy issues, which is, of course, understandable. But it's important to recognize that might happen, and then have some strategies to deal with it as well.
If I can just add just one point too, I think this is important because a lot of the guidance that's been produced post the adoption of the voluntary guidelines on tenure is really written for greenfield situations. So where you have, a kind of blank slate and you're coming in from day one. The reality is it's much more the case that you're inheriting a situation, and this led us to develop more legacy guidance, which I can talk about later.
Sorry, can I just jump on that to support it quickly? I think legacy issues and what it means to come in with further investment, try and improve on a situation is something that deserves a lot more exploration. It makes it increasingly challenging because you have no access to the information of what happened 10, 20, even 2 years ago, and it can be quite difficult to win back the trust of people that was lost more than a decade ago. And it means that you really have to resource the team and the effort to sort of steadily build that up, and again, come back to try and provide additional opportunities back to the communities that incentivize them to want to cooperate and to feel that the success of the company operating in their area is successful for them as well. And particularly with the IFC performance standards, legacy issues, I find a very challenging area for us, because to follow the performance standards to the letter of the law can be quite challenging depending what the extent of past impacts have been. And when you start to think about livelihood restoration for something that happened 20 years ago or might have happened at the hand of the government, for example, it's a real big gray area as to who and how much to compensate and what a company or an investment can bear in terms of the cost to do that, as well as the time it takes. So, apologies.
No, these are really important issues. We could talk for a long time about legacy issues. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. So, Jeff, next question is for you. You obviously know the survey well, intimately. Did any of the results surprise you?
Yeah, I think some of the results were really intuitive when you think about what it means to invest in a landscape where land rights are contentious, and clearly the sample had a lot of investments in Africa and South America. But I think one thing, maybe it's a naive perception, but we thought we would see a lot higher degree of record keeping within the company, or that responded to the survey around the financial risks, the risks that they might have borne because they had invested and things went south. We found very low response rates to questions where we're asking a bit more information on, well, what happened when you had a land tenure risk or a conflict? And related to that, the use of financial or quantitative methods to assess land risks as part of a portfolio or as part of your due diligence. It really is kind of that on-the-ground, looking at the project with your own eyes, the qualitative side of things that had a lot of responses within the survey, but a lot less on the quantitative side. So I think we thought, well, we have investors, we have businesses, we'll get a lot of numbers, we'll get a lot of figures, but it took a bit of effort to get even that in the survey this time.
Interesting. I actually had the opposite reaction, because I spoke with a lot of investors beforehand to sort of design the survey, and a lot of folks said they really were focusing on qualitative. So I was, I guess, pleasantly surprised that there was almost half the sample was dealing with, or had some quantitative metrics. That's interesting, different perspectives. Okay, on to the next question, Sylvia. How important are land tenure risks to the success of your investments in agriculture and forestry? And what lessons has Finance in Motion learned about project design and selection?
Well, let me focus in my answer probably on forest plantation, because I think that's the most difficult asset class we're currently operating, because here we're talking about long-term investments, and where obviously land is the key asset in which we invest, and these are also large-scale investments. So we talk generally about 20 million investment, large-scale. 10,000 hectares, 20,000 hectares involved. And we're exclusively operating in emerging markets. So obviously land tenure issues are extremely critical. So actually I was a bit surprised to see that among the investors it only ranked in number 7, I think, if I recall correctly. Well, we would probably place this as the number 1 risk. I mean, next to, let's say, management capabilities and track record of the company. And, well, the lessons that we drew, and a lot actually has already been talked about, so let me perhaps focus on some additional points that were not raised yet. What for us is extremely critical is that land which is under question, where we ourselves really don't get our head around what kind of different formal and informal layers of land tenure rights exist, we are not touching. And this is probably why we're also not doing shadow pricing, because, we don't think that we can really price this in. For us, it's more a binary formula, either the project works and you've got all the ingredients together to make it work, and land, tenure rights is obviously the most critical element in this equation, or things turn sour and then they really turn sour, So, just sharing a little bit my own history. I'm coming from the microfinance movement back in the late 80s. Then, I moved on as a good German citizen, Energiewende, as the acronym. So I went into renewable energy, and now I'm on land use finance, conservation finance, and definitely what can I say is the track record that we have, and we invested about $3.5 billion over the last 10 years, is that in microfinance our loss rates are minuscule. We're talking about below 0.05% actually. In renewable, it's a bit more, but we have restructuring possibilities. So, for example, if there's a flood and the hydropower plant doesn't work properly, we can extend the cash flow. We may have to invest a little bit more in maintenance, but generally you can continue running the plant. When land use conflicts arise, sometimes you can lose the entire investment, and that together with big investments that we're doing of 20 million or so, we just don't have the possibility for failure, and that's why shadow pricing doesn't help us much. So for us, it's extremely important to get that assessment right, and perhaps to share also a little bit insight into how we do that. For us, it's extremely important that we actually have local people on the ground to assess the situation, so we operate in an extremely decentralized fashion. Generally, we touch these large-scale projects only when we more or less have already people in that market who've done other sorts of investments, less risky ones, before we move into these more risky space. And then we do triangulation, which means, we're not trusting only our people, but, we ask around, different players, different other investors, and so on, because you also need exclusive solutions for a given context. In microfinance, basically, we talk about a commodity, doing, finance for a micro-entrepreneur in Uganda or in Indonesia or Colombia, the basic profile or the basic, credit profile information you need is more or less very similar. While when you involve land use, that's, you need a tailor-made solution for every specific context. And that is why it's so relevant that you talk to different people, yet that you access different networks of information just to cross-check information, to challenge certain assumptions. And what was already mentioned, to also go back in history so that you're not just, looking at the current status quo, but you need to see, what's the trajectory? Where is this whole thing coming from? How has the story evolved? To also understand better where people stand today before you get engaged, for example, in community engagement, or before you design your shared benefit scheme, because you might be completely wrong by just looking at today's situation. And obviously, this is a continuous project or process. You need to also continue doing these, analysis. So perhaps this just as some additional inputs, and I stop here to facilitate also a little bit more exchange here.
Thanks, Sylvia. I have a quick follow-up question, actually. It sounds like your sort of due diligence and assessment process for these investments is quite long. Can you give us a sense of sort of the time frame to sort of take all those steps in a very general
wow, that's a very good question. As always, it depends. Sometimes it takes us a year or even longer to actually get the project right. Because it's not just, that you need to get the business model per se up and running so that the figures match and the cash flow works and so on and so forth. What costs us most time is really this land use issue, this upfront investment, but then also to get the community benefit sharing, but also the individual economic benefits that people need to take away from it. It's not just the community level, that you need to satisfy, but also people need to individually see that they're getting something out of this whole thing. So to design that strategy very carefully takes time, because sometimes, we work on assumptions and then it's being questioned along the way, and then we need to rethink. And that is what we spend most time on. Actually, the financial modeling, the business case, that's the easiest part, I would say. It sounds perhaps a bit strange. But all these soft elements on the land tenure rights, and then on the strategy itself of community involvement and personal benefit sharing, that's where really we spend a lot of thinking into.
Well, it's good to hear, I think, from USAID. I mean, we work a lot in our work with companies, we work on sort of the community engagement strategies and that more holistic sort of planning for the investment to make sure that local folks benefit. But I know that that can be sometimes at odds maybe with the investment timeline. Sometimes, you need to make a decision one way or the other, and you don't always have, the time to do that full year of planning and that sort of thing. So I think with our work, there's definitely that push and pull between getting it right, but making a decision at the same time.
No, I mean, again, on forestry plantation, for example, we've seen, lots of situations where then these firms had to engage in some bridge financing because we were just not basically ready yet. And this comes at an extremely high cost. I mean, debt financing in forestry in emerging markets, I mean, I'm not sure whether this would stand any consumer rights legal frameworks that we know from the Western world, I have to say. But also, we have a fiduciary responsibility vis-a-vis our investors. So we need to be absolutely sure, and again, comes in this binary, equation that I mentioned before. If you get it wrong, your entire investment can go belly up. And with this very, large-scale investments that you're doing, and you have a high concentration in your portfolio, I mean, if you have even a 200 million portfolio, it's enormously large for forest plantation, what you find worldwide. If you have a 20 million investment, 25 million investment in there, that's 10% or even more of your entire portfolio. If that goes wrong, that really taints your track record. So you need to really be diligent in what you're doing, even if that may have implications on timing.
Can I just add on this point? Sorry, but it is actually a fundamental tension, and we were talking about this yesterday offline, but to get the upfront process right of community engagement, understanding local context, and using maybe some of the traditional models that all of us have been using, which I would maybe unfairly say is doing a lot of that in-house, or say hiring a consultancy to do it. Maybe those models need to be adapted a little bit more. So one example, somebody said this morning, you haven't said much about civil society and its role. I mean, I think we can probably all get smarter at using the local knowledge. You said, using local partners, people who are already knowledgeable, but also local NGOs who know the situation, and not because we all tend to regard NGOs as maybe too monolithic in the critics, but there's a lot of operational folks out there that really know the local communities much better. There's just one more point on how we can change how we do this. There's a lot of work now evolving very quickly in terms of new due diligence tools which take advantage of technology and geospatial information and data. Jürgen Vogele in one of the panels this morning was talking about all the data and the fact that the bank is able to see on a daily basis what the local conditions are in a given community. In the same way, there's a lot of capacity to understand, looking at different parameters, what the local situation is before you ever put boots on the ground. And so that's a way to kind of understand where the primary risks are sooner in the process, and then maybe find ways to shorten the period to what's really critical path.
If I may just follow on what just said, for us it's very important to have a good filtering mechanism, so that those things that we would not want to touch because of the reasons that I mentioned before, we quickly get it out of the way. So, just to give you an example, we looked recently at an investment opportunity in a Latin American country. The first thing that we did was really geospatial information, so basically plotting the land and looking at, do we see any illegal invasion into that land? And we could actually find cocoa production on that land. And after we discussed it with the landowner, who was aware of the situation and didn't tell us, this combination of, we are not being told, basically we have to find out ourselves. And secondly, you see pockets which you cannot isolate, where you cannot say, okay, I basically don't touch that land, but still, the rest of the land I can work in a uniform way. Since we couldn't figure that out, we simply said no. We would not, move forward. And I think everyone here has these kind of filtering mechanisms to sort out those things early on in the process that are, where you would just say, from a risk perspective, you shouldn't really touch it.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think that maybe brings, Mary Kate, if you want to sort of go next, I was going to ask you about New Forest's approach to mitigating land tenure risks, and maybe talking a little bit about the Malaysia project, and those issues would be a nice complement, sorry, to what Sylvia just said.
Yeah, absolutely. Building on both Mark and Sylvia, your comments that it is a time and resource extensive process to get it right. And as investors, we need to find ways to get the information so we can make well-informed and responsible decisions in a reasonable time frame, and then set up the appropriate strategies to sort of steadily work through whatever legacy or new current issues you've encountered, and make sure that you're setting up a good social license to operate moving forward. The example from Malaysia that Sarah's referring to is actually the first investment of our Tropical Asia Forest Fund. The TAF, as we call it, was launched in 2013, a $170 million fund with a combination of development finance institution, pension, and fund-to-fund money. So a real good combination in there itself of interests investing for the first time in Southeast Asian forestry, with a dedicated focus on plantation forests. So Acacia Forest Industries and its parent company, Hijuan Bangkok Plantations, was our first investment in 2013. As we diligenced that asset, we applied the standards that we bring from our corporate perspective, which is something we do across all of New Forest business, as well as a specific set of E&S requirements for our Asian fund. And all of our funds have their own E&S policy, but what that is taking our high-level corporate policies and saying, in this investment geography, for these types of assets, these are the steps you need to follow in acquisitions and operations, and with respect to ongoing reporting over time. So we make it very clear for all of our portfolio managers and operations teams and what they need to do going forward. The requirements in there, we are in due diligence have to do a land tenure review and have that done by a qualified external third party, which I think has been referenced. Finding the right group with the right local expertise is always very situation specific. In the case of this Malaysian asset, which was a long-established plantation originally built in the 1980s as part of a watershed protection program with, I believe, some World Bank money back in the day, was doing reforestation on a drought-impacted, deforested peninsula in northern Borneo. So that project, established with wonderful aims, 30 years on, is continuing to face a lot of legacy issues in terms of unclear land rights. It's a highly densely populated area, and that's something we knew, and we could tell very quickly from due diligence, from our knowledge of the asset, from speaking to others in industry. But as investors, the original question is there an asset here that can be managed responsibly, that can hit the return that we have a fiduciary responsibility to try and deliver to our investors? The due diligence included an IFC Performance Standards Gap Assessment, an FSC review. The asset is actually already FSC certified, which is tremendous, and not necessarily common in a lot of the assets that we look at. Moving into operations, once we've made that decision that we can go ahead, we then work with the portfolio companies to help them improve on what we found from those gap assessments, creating an environmental and social action plan and ensuring that the company is following through for a continual improvement on that. And within that, we've got all the good guidance on things like FPIC, livelihoods, workers' rights, et cetera, that really drive the social programming in those assets. But as a concrete example in Malaysia of the actual work it takes to address legacy issues in a high population area, and we're talking 59 different villages in 25,000 hectare gazetted area. So it's quite a lot of different villages to deal with. We first did a social baseline study saying we know there's 25 plus years of bits of confusion. Not all of the communities had their boundaries fully recognized legally by the government. As a private entity, we can't do much to help that. We can inform them, the communities, how to work through the legal system. We can remind the legal operators and the right people in the right agencies that these boundaries still need further demarcation, but we can't solve it for them. We unfortunately can't hand back land, but we can decide how we manage that land based on the best information about customary and actual land use that's going on. So we did about 18 months of a social baseline survey to understand what's actually happening on this peninsula now, what types of activities are households engaged in, what land are they using, et cetera. The next layer was a deeper review of that, moving into participatory mapping. Again, that took another 18 months. On the note of NGOs, we work with a local NGO who's actually hired to conduct the participatory mapping that ensures there's better trust with the community's openness in working with that NGO as compared to the face of a company on its own. That participatory mapping showed us there is quite a lot of overlapping interest in using land that the company would like to use. So in the interim, the company is not planting on contested areas, we would call them, or you might potentially call them encroached areas, I wouldn't call it that, but where we believe there's legitimate land claims, not operating on those, and instead looking for participatory or joint venture models where we can jointly plant and provide an interest back to the communities in those land uses going forward. We're just now, and we're talking 5 years after investment with a steady program, piloting those models and beginning to work through them in 2018. So I say this to be very open about it is a long process to work through these things, even with the benefit of things like the IFC performance standards, working with local NGOs, having sort of all the right pieces and using the whole list of qualitative and not most of the quantitative measures to follow through on this, it takes a great deal of time. So one thing I would highlight is that we should create or welcome the expectation that addressing land tenure is an ongoing issue. It's not something that can be solved that makes things investment ready. It's something that investors need to be able to work through, and that groups like USAID, IFC and advisory services, et cetera, can continue to provide meaningful resources to help companies and investors just continually work on improving the situation.
Thanks, Mary Kate. I have a quick follow-up for you, but I also wanted to let the audience know that after I ask this question, I have plenty of questions to continue asking the panelists, but we'd love to hear from you. If you have experiences around mitigating land tenure risks, please come to the podium and share those, or if you have questions of the panelists, please ask them as well, as soon as I get one more question in. Mary Kate, you mentioned that you can provide information to local communities and support them as needed to get legal documentation or sort of legal land rights, but you also undertake some participatory mapping as well to help understand what land claims they would ideally get that documentation for and make sure that you're not infringing on their rights in any way. Do you see an opportunity for the participatory mapping to sort of feed into that more formal process? Is that envision that might assist them achieve formal, maybe, rights recognition? I'm wondering because our office certainly thinks the participatory mapping is a really good approach. We use it a lot in our projects. So I'm curious what you think about that.
That's a great question. And I should say that from day one when we met this company, one of the ways we were informed they handle land issues is by providing resources, letting them know what the local agency is and how to work through it in order to submit a claim, et cetera, how to move through that process. Now that's been going on for years, and it's clearly not super effective in this case, which was one survey finding I had mentioned to both Jeff and Sarah. I found surprising that people could formally help others recognize their land rights, because in our experience, that's not been something forthcoming. We're just having to continue to work without formal legal recognition, but ensuring that we respect them. It came up in the participatory mapping that basically these mechanisms were not well understood, not well accessed. So one of the immediate results of that was then to put on a series of workshops over about 6 months with different clusters of the villages where we brought together pertinent government agencies, NGOs, and others for natural resource-based management workshops. This is not crazy innovative stuff. Probably all of you guys as practitioners in the room would think about doing these types of things. But the company was able to host them, to sponsor the reps to come from the capital city a few hours away, to bring the right people together, to provide a forum for the community representatives to actually engage directly and have that conversation and to find out what they needed to do to move forward with these claims. And I do think that the participatory mapping process is empowering in that perspective, because you have individuals walking with a team and you're actually showing, the village JKK, like a headman, the leader, how, you've got the GPS in his hand, so he can say, here is this area of our community, and then you have others from households doing it saying, well, we're not growing anything here now, but we've long intended that that's the next area for where we'll grow something. So they're physically actually giving you a proper map, so why wouldn't you use that to formally recognize that land tenure? Again, that becomes a sort of sticky area when you're in the private sector of how much can you push or suggest or recommend that the government follow through on the ability to sort of formally recognize these things, and a great area for, I think, the USAID and others to step in to help that conversation. And that might be a really concrete learning. If there are people investing to do community mapping, participatory mapping, how do we make the most out of all of those results, not just for the company's use, but back to the communities, back to the government together?
Thanks. Well, we'll continue working in the area for sure with investors and others. Thank you so much for all your responses and participation in the discussion. I don't see anyone at the podium, but do the audience members have any experiences they'd like to share, questions? I don't know if we have any online questions that might have come in. I don't see any on the screen. But I also have plenty of questions to keep on asking. Okay, well, we see if there's any online questions. Okay, is there one? Oh, okay. So let's sort of wrap this question, sort of your main takeaways, into the final question I'll ask in a few minutes. Thanks, Aiden. We'll fit that in. Okay, so I have a few more.
Maybe they're telling us they want us to wrap up.
Okay, well, we can also do that. We always need some more time for networking. I do want to fit in at least one more or two. Jeff, in your work, for example, with USAID and investors to implement land and resource tenure best practices in Mozambique and Kenya, what approaches to land tenure risk mitigation seem most practical and feasible for the companies that you work with?
Okay, thanks. So by way of background, Indufor worked with USAID and Ilovo Sugar, which is a sugar company in Mozambique, but operates broadly in Southern Africa, and the Moringa Partnership, which is an investment vehicle in Paris that invests in agro-forestry in Africa and Latin America. And we worked collaboratively with Ilovo and Moringa to implement something called the analytical framework, which is basically a tool to help assess and improve the way the company affects legitimate land rights. I think the key takeaway was we worked with a large multinational, Ilovo, that has operated in Mozambique since the end of the Civil War, and a smaller company, an investment vehicle that invests in I would say, relatively very small projects compared to Ilovo. But a couple of things came out quite clearly from that, which was the need for knowing the supply chain. So in both models, they were using a core plantation plus outgrowers, and there was, I guess, limited information at the beginning of the project in terms of who were the outgrowers, how they had acquired land, and in the case of Ilovo, we worked to map the parcel boundaries of many of the smallholders that agreed to participate in the project. And in the case of Moringa in Kenya, we worked to identify risks related to land tenure rights in the supply chain driven by smallholders in a cooperative. In both instances, I think there were a lot of historical land claims in the area, which were difficult to disentangle. But you had a lot of firepower from Ilovo. They had staff and vehicles and agronomists and social scientists, and there's a very different aspect to the work. And then in Kenya, it was a smaller operation that had just started up. They had an agronomist, but they were also hiring staff as they went along. So, but in both cases, this critical piece of their project was uncertain. So I think there are some things that can be done at different levels and with different magnitude, basically. So, implementing simple tenure verification protocols, little forms that the outgrower manager can use to check documents to make sure that the person that they're engaging in a contract has some legal right to that land. in the case of a company with more resources, they can support through independent parties the mapping of land rights and potentially the application for land titles. But it's that element of being curious about who's in your supply chain, how did they get there, what proof do they have in terms of their land rights, and if they don't have proof, why don't they? What can be done to find different avenues to verify the land rights in the area? So, I don't, there's a lot of complexity related to land tenure, but it is something that social scientists know well, anthropologists know well. So, kind of integrating different skill sets into the operational features of a company or an investor might be a starting point.
Thanks, and I think we see that strategy in some of the case studies as well, where a team of social scientists and others with background in the issue have been helpful in mitigating some land risks. Okay, so I think I'll follow your suggestion, Mark. I think we'll wrap up a little bit early. I do have one final question for each of the panelists. Before we finish, I'm curious what opportunities you see for donors or development organizations like USAID to really support responsible investment that respects land rights and provides benefits for local individuals and communities. Where should we be focusing our efforts? And there's been some allusion to this, but it'd be good to hear sort of your closing thoughts on that question. Mark, maybe we can start there and we can sort of come around this.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit first, and then I'll answer the question. Just to build on this idea of community mapping, participatory mapping, and I think let's the gorilla in the room here, right? We haven't talked about if that's the right metaphor, is government performance. So you have. Is there, in fact, a regulatory or legal framework that enshrines customary rights and communal tenure rights or whatever in law? If that doesn't exist, obviously that has to happen. Same thing, then the question is it implemented? Let's assume the answer to those is either a little bit or no, one or the other or both. Then your companies are faced, and then investors who are facilitating an operation like IFC are faced with, how do we make up for that deficiency and still meet our performance standards, still, basically ensure that we know there's a strong business case to be made for strengthening local license to operate for the reasons that I already mentioned about the cost of disruption. And there, I think participatory mapping is an emerging tool. It's not new, but it is finding more and more use and probably needs to be ramped up much more and put in as regular practice. Because what that does is, if you assume that, for example, and not always the case, but that a concession agreement between a private operator and the government is made in a closed-door situation in the capital, and then the local communities are the last to find out, then the operator, through a participatory mapping exercise and where you have an asymmetric power equation with local communities, that mapping exercise in and of itself, helping people more clearly define, using GPS and all that, what their usage areas are, what resources are they accessing for farming, for hunting, for medicinal purposes, whatever the case may be, empowers them. Because now they have an output which has literally graphically defined their area of operation, their zone of influence, if you want to call it that. And that then subsequently empowers them and creates a de facto recognition of rights which may not be legally enshrined, and that at least helps. In terms of what USAID and other donors, governments can do, I would say one is to focus much more on how we collectively build capacity on the social side, meaning capacity for companies. And I mentioned earlier, we're working more and more down mark with local companies. They don't have the local people, the human resources to hire. So even if they get it, and they want to, they can't find people who are qualified to do this. So I would put one major priority is literally, supporting programs that train people on community engagement, good practice, and train people on how to dialogue with communities, not just at the front end, as has been said, but on an ongoing basis. So that would be kind of, for me, at the top of the list. And then stating the obvious is also World Bank, other institutions, to work with governments on getting the right legal and regulatory frameworks in place.
Thanks. And yes, we're certainly doing both of those, but I would agree that the training on community engagement would really be helpful, because while they may work with NGOs on some of the engagement, they need someone at the company who really sort of believes in that and sort of pushes that agenda forward, if not more than one person. Thanks, Mark. Sylvia, how about you? What's your perspective on the way we can better support responsible investment?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing what Mark just said in terms of what's the obvious entry point, and that's to help ensure that there's a conducive regulatory environment in the first place. But I mean, we're also, realistic in the sense, or pragmatic in the sense that this will take time. I mean, the voluntary standards are out, or guidelines are out for quite some time, but to transpose this into, national laws, I mean, that's going to take time. So in the absence of that, I think we need to look at the risk mitigation strategies, to work around a certain uncertainty when it comes to land tenure rights and land use. And a lot has been said already about, participatory community-based engagement. And there, I would like to drive the message home that it's not just a capacity issue, to ensure that the people are there who can actually do that, but it's also a monetary issue. If we do the calculation, we certainly are willing to basically, absorb part of these costs. It's part of our basically production costs, if you want to call it like that. But there's also a limit to that, yeah. And certain elements, like for example, outgrower schemes, it's enormously costly. If that has not been done before, if it's a new venture, that cost can really turn your investment non-profitable, or at least not sufficiently profitable. So I think there we also need to see up to what level can a private, and should a private company bear these costs, but what are maybe elements where you would see also something like a common good to which you're contributing, and where probably a donor intervention and payment would probably be helpful. Then the other critical element that has not been mentioned yet is de-risking instruments. Coming back to what I said earlier, this binary equation, if these kind of, for example, forest investments go belly up, it's large losses we're talking about. So therefore, de-risking instruments are critical in my view, and we've seen this in the recent discussions we had around a new forest fund, where even the IFIs, and I'm talking here, not mentioning names, but the usual suspects, even they said, we're not willing to go into an investment, of 12 to 15 years in forest plantations, because that's too long term, and that's too much uncertainty. And also, it doesn't really fit into any of our asset buckets. This is not a real estate project. This is not commodity financing. This is not infrastructure financing. So this is actually private equity. And then you immediately measured against, private equity return expectations of 15% plus, which you never will be able. I mean, at least not with forest investments. I have not seen such investments, that can generate these high returns of 20% and above. With some landscape or land use, other land use projects, you certainly can. Sustainable cattle was mentioned this morning, but not with forestry. And so I think it's extremely critical that also de-risking is being provided. As I said, if even development finance institutions, which for which this should be their day-to-day bread and butter business, are not willing to take that risk, someone else needs probably to at least partly de-risk. And then I think it's overall a question of institutional ecosystem development. Coming back to what Jennifer Price mentioned this morning, we by far have not really closed the dots from the green bonds down to the actual investments on the ground, and to help basically intermediaries to come into play and to strengthen that as well, I think is important, because, you know, community development is a good thing, but you still need these intermediaries, the investors, which are actually willing to structure these projects and to pool funds and to deploy these funds. But there are not that many around, I have to say. So to help, you know, creating also ecosystems, I think would certainly do good. Just perhaps to mention a recent initiative of the Luxembourg government, which is one of the development finance centers in Europe, where, you know, the local government put up a platform where they actually help young asset managers, but with a particular interest in impact investing, to help them, you know, with some initial grant financing and so on to get off the ground and to, you know, structure projects that then could be serving as conduits for investing, for example, for the Luxembourg government and others.
Those are some great ideas, lots to think about. Mary-Kate, what are your ideas?
Sure. I'm just reflecting on this great session, and I think there's been 5 people up here talking about projects, investors, and companies who are trying to do things right in relatively complex situations. And so what can groups like USAID and other donors do to advance that? I think you guys are already very much on the right path in terms of improving the toolkits, building capacity, getting the skill sets right. Sharing case studies, I think, is super important, because I do think there needs to be a bit more open and frank discussion of how this stuff works, the pitfalls, the challenges, and that there will still be risk and issues to be managed going forward. It's not simple. I think that's one side. But what I'm more motivated around is not the deals we have done, which I think we've got great community work going on. There's a lot of potential and opportunity there. But thinking about the objective of GLF as a whole, and hearing the earlier suggestion that we were going to get 250 million hectares of restoration and reforestation by 2050, that means we can't just do the deals we're already doing, the ones that we've decided within reasonable parameters of investment that we can diligence and go ahead securely on moving forward. It's the deals that we had to pass up, or the ones that were too complicated or that took too much time. And that's something we spent a lot of time thinking about at New Forest as we reflected back on what was our experience with the Tropical Asia Forest Fund, what were the deals we wish we did, what ones do we need more time, which ones was the return just a bit too low for the current market expectations, or which ones would we have needed other support. So we called those sort of our barriers to sustainable landscape investment. And I think to address those barriers, we need more innovative partnerships that are bringing together different sources of capital and different sources of skills and resources. I think blended finance is a promising opportunity. If that's sort of too complicated to stack capital at the simplest level, I think donor funds going in right properly alongside pure commercial investors to provide dedicated technical assistance facilities would let us mobilize a lot more capital a lot more effectively, with the knowledge that we can manage these challenging issues going forward and not having to sort of underwrite that whole risk upfront by ourselves and depend on getting the right resources, capacity, and skills and developing that. But to have dedicated technical assistance funds, I think could be really transformative for those emerging markets forestry funds like Finance in Motion, like New Forests, like Althelia, and those others. I think you would see scale happen a lot more quickly with that type of dedicated resource.
Thanks, Mary-Kate. And I think that's really relevant, too, because the work that we've done with specific companies in specific geographies do get at, right, like how to mitigate their risks and sort of test out some of the models. But at the moment, it's not scalable in the sense of a facility that would be able to provide sort of this ongoing technical assistance around land tenure, which, as we all know, is a super complex thing to undertake.
And we can't just hire Jeff full-time, so.
And Jeff, what would your perspective be?
Just a few. I mean, USAID has a long history of working very successfully on land tenure at the kind of government level, working on policy, legislation, on-the-ground programs to do participatory mapping, testing new tools. So I think, you know, your openness to the private sector is commendable at this stage. I mean, the maturity of the USAID Land Tenure Unit is there, and there is an openness from the private sector to engage, I think, on land with USAID, with development partners that I haven't seen so much in the past, but you know, taking advantage of that, sharing the lessons, the tools on mapping. I mean, for example, in the work we did in Mozambique, the development of that tool, you know, took a few years. The MAST program that you have has taken years, but sharing that widely, getting it out in use, and seeing how it could be kind of an information tool for the company, not just to benefit the community. So clearly, that's one of your chief goals, but identifying options where the company benefits maybe just as much, or just, you know, in a different way than the community might from engaging in your projects. I think one of the questions was about grievance mechanisms. Grievance mechanisms are part of all the standards now on land, figuring out how to do that, training staff at companies to develop them, maybe even developing the back end on the administrative tools to receive grievances and track them through time, and how they're resolved would be you know, something that could be integrated into a project that's ongoing, because it does take quite a lot of effort to develop one and integrate it and train the staff. So that's just one example, but I think the information that USAID has on land is very valuable to groups that are looking to invest in land, and that could be shared, I think, even more proactively.
Thanks, that's a great point. Yeah, we have country profiles around land tenure in most of the countries that we work in, so it can be helpful to understand the context, the laws, the policies, the on-the-ground realities related to land tenure. Well, thank you all very much for this really great discussion. It's been fascinating to learn about your strategies for risk mitigation related to land. They're quite different between the two companies here, but then also in the case studies, I think it's really interesting to see the wide range of strategies and approaches to land tenure risk mitigation. USAID is committed to strengthening land and resource tenure rights across the world through sort of the policy aspect and the land administration system, but we'll continue this work, really important work on with responsible investors on these critical topics, and look forward to hearing more, you know, how we can do that better and thinking about some of these ideas as well. So thanks to everyone for participating, and thanks to you all in the audience as well.